disaster preparedness best practices. So I think it's something that we've all kind of worked through here over the past 4 or 5 months, and maybe a little bit too fresh in everybody's minds. But this session, ultimately, we want to cover the phases of an emergency management consideration for a disaster recovery plan. As you may have seen, I am not Taylor Rote. Again, pinch hitting here for Taylor, who was unable to present today. Sorry for another baseball reference for everyone there. But unfortunately, she wasn't able to present, but she put together a great presentation here. And I'm going to do my best to fill in and prepare the presentation or present the information that she had prepared based on the notes that she provided. So emergency management, I'll just kind of start. It's always good to start at the beginning and kind of set definitions here for what emergency management is. And essentially, it's a program designed to identify all potential disastrous events that may affect and disrupt the government. And that can be a lot of different things for a lot of different entities, but it also includes the plans to mitigate or respond to these disruptions. Obviously, in having emergency management, the goal is to ultimately prevent any major impact to the services that are being provided to the constituents that are being provided by the local government. Obviously, I think everybody realizes this is important, again, especially over the past 4 to 5 months. And obviously, the public is depending on the services that are being provided. And a lot of those are essential services that the local governments are providing to the constituents and to the individuals involved. Any disruptions to those obviously could have a significant impact on the community. And again, I think there's a wide variety or a wide array there of the disruptions. It can be something as minimal as a tree limb down on a road, or it could be something as significant as a utilities services being disrupted for a significant time period. So that again can range, and again, but the emergency management is ultimately proven or trying to have an effect to eliminate or reduce the impact that has for those services that are provided. So we're just going to go through the overall phases of the emergency management. And on the next slide is a very good summary here of the cycle. And it just kind of breaks it down in a couple different sections. So I'm going to walk through this cycle here shortly. As you can see, the line that's kind of right in the middle of the slide, that's where the actual disaster occurs. So that's what that line represents. Everything above the line is obviously before the disaster occurred, and that's more considered for protection or more the risk management side of things. So the 3 components of that, are mitigation and prevention, preparedness, and prediction and early warning. So again, that's more of the risk side of things and the risk management, and not the actual actions being taken once the disaster has occurred. Once the disaster does occur, then obviously you have a couple different factors there, and that moves more to the recovery side of things. So you have impact assessment, you have your response, what you're doing immediately, and then probably where everybody is now in relation to COVID-19 is kind of between the recovery and the reconstruction period during this time period. So once that disaster occurs, again, you're moving more towards the recovery and more towards the crisis management of that. As you're going through and pulling together the different pieces of the emergency management cycle, I think the key to all these phases is ultimately gathering as much information as you can. Especially before the disaster occurs, the more information you have in advance, the better equipped you are to respond to that once the disaster occurs. So it's just trying to, again, gather as much information from as many different sources as possible will ultimately help in the response and the recovery for that disaster. So we're going to go through the 4 key phases of that emergency management. Again, first and foremost, you're going to do what you can to mitigate. And those are the actions to be taken to prevent or reduce the cause, impact, or consequences of the disaster. A couple of examples of these are insurance policies that may be purchased, as well as making backups of any technology that can be done throughout the year. The next piece just moves into more of the preparedness side of things, and that's where the actual planning and training occurs for anything that cannot be mitigated against. So again, if you can't make or cannot take any action to ultimately mitigate those, then that's going to move down into the preparedness side of things. And I think the second bullet point here is of utmost importance. When it comes to this, it's much better to be resilient and trying to plan ahead than to be reactive. If you're reactive, then you're kind of making decisions on the fly. And obviously, it's best to have a game plan in place. And that's really where a disaster recovery plan comes into mind. After you get through those two steps, again, we're kind of below the line of the disaster occurring. So the first step is the response, and that's the immediate aftermath of the disaster occurring. And ultimately, you're then implementing or beginning to implement the disaster recovery plan that hopefully was in place from the preparedness category. And then finally, once you kind of get through the immediate aftermath, then you're into the recovery mode. So there you're trying to restore as many efforts as possible to basically continue your regular operations. Now that may look a little bit differently during that recovery. As Bob said, you may have individuals working from home, but hopefully those operations are still continuing for those. This is typically the longest phase that most people face during the emergency management cycle. It just takes a while to ultimately recover from that disaster. And then it also leads in again to the restoration efforts. When it comes to the restoration efforts, again, I think something to keep in mind is this is a cycle. It's ever going. So you always want to keep that in mind. Obviously, as we've all come out of COVID-19 here, it's best now to revisit the plans that you had in place, what worked, what didn't, and what can be done differently next time. So again, as that comes full circle there, you just want to take it while it's still fresh and do what you can to document that, make notes, revise the plans, so hopefully that way you can learn from it and make it a better process the next time it comes into place. So again, I know it's still fresh. Everybody may not want to think about it right now, but it is good to kind of revisit that while it is still fresh and in everybody's minds. Next, we'll just get into a little bit talking about the disaster recovery plan and the development of that plan and just some considerations related to that. So the first and foremost, you kind of want to define what the purpose is. And again, what ultimately does your organization consider to be a disaster? And that can be many different phases and basically a lot of different items for a lot of different entities, governmental entities. But I think the key question there to step back and ask is what ultimately could go wrong? What could go wrong for the governmental entity? What could you have to respond to? And then understand what your specific risks are for different situations. Again, you want to consider as many considerations or possibilities as you can. The more that you consider, the better equipped you'll be to respond to any disasters or emergencies that were to occur. So from there, as part of your doing that, again, you want to consider all potential disruptions and the associated impacts of that. If you're no longer able to be in the building, as we were for a while here at SEK, what do those evacuation plans look like and what can you do to work remotely in a remote environment? Along with that is the loss of physical property. The example we have here, it's not related to COVID-19, but we had a very small entity. It was a small authority. They had an executive director and just a couple of other employees. Things went south at a board meeting one night. The executive director was let go during the meeting. He proceeded to walk out to his office. He picked up the laptop, which had the QuickBooks file on it, which was their accounting software they were using. And he walked out the door to never be seen or heard from again. So obviously that created a disaster for that particular entity as they had to recreate all of the accounting records for that. Obviously that's related to a very small entity. Larger entities that wouldn't have the same potential impact and wouldn't have those same capabilities, but it's just something to keep in mind when it comes to loss of physical property. And then you also have there, again, security threats when it comes to IT and data breaches, as well as global pandemics, which again, may not have been here on this slide if we presented this 6 months ago, but here we are today, and again, kind of working through that environment. So I just think when it comes to the disruptions, kind of determining what is the most essential and what are the most critical impacts that could have, and again, that can vary amongst the different entities. The other key piece of this when it comes to a disaster recovery plan or kind of an emergency management process is to have identified who the key personnel are and what are their responsibilities. What we really recommend there is to ultimately develop an emergency response team, and you don't want that to just be the finance department. Again, it comes down to the overall services that are being provided. I think it's going to be a lot of different individuals from your organization that are part of that emergency response team, and they're going to dictate kind of what are those critical functions that are going to be needed to continue to provide services to both the constituents as well as internal, such as paying payroll from the finance departments. Just a couple of things to consider there on who to be involved. You kind of want the full gamut of the people, full gamut of individuals to be involved in that process. Just a couple of other minor considerations, again, when it comes down to having a disaster recovery plan, having some distribution and maintenance plans. Again, how is the information going to be relayed? Personally here at SEK, as COVID-19 started to happen, we had an emergency response team. They were, what seemed like on a regular basis for a while, were sending out details related to working from home and what our protocols were. At first, they were coming out once a week. Within working in a remote environment, sometimes those were coming out daily. And I think there might have even been a day where we received 2 of those communications in the same day. So again, just making sure that the information is ultimately getting provided to the individuals that need it, i.e. the employees, and so that they understand where that is. You also want to consider, as those communications are made, if they're made in person, if you have a Zoom meeting or a Teams call, where will you store that information so that everybody can readily access that information in the future, should they need to reference that again. Also, you just want to come back and determine how often these processes should be revisited. When it comes to a disaster recovery plan, it's not something that you can come up with and put on a shelf. Again, you want to revisit that as new technologies change, as employees change, that they ultimately understand that process and make sure that they have an understanding that it is up to date and can be used. And that kind of leads right into the next piece of this when it comes to the plan is to offer training. And again, how often will that training occur? What scenarios will be tested? When it comes to developing a plan, it looks, again, it sounds great if you have it sitting there on a shelf, but if you're unable to test it, you don't know if that plan works. So you want to go through certain plans and offer training on those and ultimately test that the plans are going to work how they're intended to. So it's just something to consider there when it comes to training. If it's IT security, are there webinars that can be done, or online trainings? If it's online, again, evacuation procedures, if the office is unable to be accessed, as well as in-house trainings, again, that can be done via Zoom or Teams in today's environment. So the next piece, again, I realize everybody's kind of already worked through this, but again, you want to make sure that their adequate records are maintained on part of the emergency management piece of this, and just to make sure that adequate records are kept. I've listed out a couple of details here for pertinent records to include. Again, you want to have activity logs. That way, any key incidents that are occurring during the disaster can be kept, monitored, and responded to. The next piece is labeled as a cost report for any supplies, equipment purchased. If you still have access to your general ledger, that may be that piece of that. But you also just want to look at all the purchases that are made to make sure that any inventory is maintained on a regular basis that needs to be purchased. So it may not be something you need right away, but in a month or two, you may need something. And if you have to plan for that, you want to be able to do so. The other key piece of this is just having those assigned roles for the emergency response team, so that everybody's on the same page and everybody knows what their roles are and how the information will be communicated to them. And then the fourth bullet point that we have, obviously you want to have what those critical business functions are, and ultimately what the impact is if they're not available, and what you're going to do to respond to those and get those back up and running as soon as you can. So for that, again, I think it just comes down to just trying to be as prepared as possible and making sure you have adequate records for each of those on a regular basis. The last item that we have, again, just comes back down to communication. Again, I think it's a key difference for internal communication for your employees, but also making sure that your constituents understand the services that they provide and are available. So the key thing there, I think that's really changed over the past couple of years. I'm not going to say positively or negatively, but with social media, obviously it's able to get a message out very quickly to the constituents in a very concise format. And I remember back when I was in school, I always wanted a snow day, and you had one of two options. You either called into a hotline and you called every 5 minutes hoping that school was delayed or canceled, or you'd sit and watch TV and watch the little ticker float across. Where I went to school, we were at Washington County. We were always at the bottom of the alphabet or toward the end of the alphabet. And every time when it got close, it would go to commercial and then it would start back over. So those days are gone. I realize I'm completely dating myself to those individuals that are younger here. But again, with having social media, it just offers another alternative for that. So I want to briefly just talk about the impact here of COVID-19. Obviously, again, that's been a significant impact here over the couple of years. And again, I think it forced a lot of entities to maybe create some of these plans on the fly. So the more planning that you can have done in advance, obviously, the better prepared everybody will be to be able to respond to that. So I have one last joke that I'm going to tell for this when it relates to COVID-19. And our IT department, they are awesome when it comes to this. The other day I was working on my laptop. I didn't have a mask on. I sneezed, and the antivirus software popped right up on the computer for that. I've never seen anything like that. And I commend our IT department for being proactive when it comes to that. That's the end of my terrible jokes. I promise for that. So just a couple of things to do here when it comes down to the continuity of operations. Again, Bob already alluded to some of these, but again, it comes to coming up with existing plans and more adaptive ways. And again, I think just having the ability to adapt is critical. Again, I think when we first came out with some of our plans from working in a remote environment or working with our clients, they changed on a weekly basis, again, sometimes on a daily basis. And again, I think it's just being open to that and being able to be flexible and provide the employees and as well as providing those services to our entities. And again, just coming back to and reviewing those essential functions and personnel. That's obviously the most important piece, is being able to provide those services. And there's multiple guides that are available. So the FEMA website, I have a couple references or external resources on the next slide to look at. But again, just something to keep in mind there when it comes to those key functions and personnel. You also want to establish and practice telework capabilities in advance. I know before COVID-19 hit, again, here at SEK, we went from about 98% of us working in the office. Within about a week to 10 days, we were about 98% out of the office. So having a game plan in place obviously made that transition a little bit more smooth, or as smooth as it could have been given the situation. And I think when it comes down to employees, it's important to have check-ins with those employees to find out what's working, what is not. Several employees may be having the same issue, but if it's not communicated, obviously it can't be fixed. So you want to make sure you're reaching out, trying to check in with the employees for what's working and what's not working, and obviously including make sure that you're covered from an IT perspective to make sure that you are covered from a control perspective. So you also just want to consider technologies to expand virtual options to engage citizens. I know most governments have kind of worked through this, again, over the past couple of months. I've seen a couple of meetings get canceled for several of our clients, while others I've seen anywhere from in-person meetings with social distancing. I've heard of public meetings in parking lots. And obviously the most common is now moving to Zoom or team meetings, which seems to be going fairly smoothly. But you just obviously want to keep the community engaged and have the ability to include them in those meetings. So the final slide that I have here for today are just some external resources. These are available for preparedness and operational continuity. The first one's for the Office of Domestic Preparedness, and that's a component of the Department of Homeland Security. And then the other one is the Office of State and Local Government Coordination and Preparedness. These offer a lot of planning resources as well as looking at disaster recovery plan testing that can be offered for your local governments. So the last slide, or last bullet point that I have, is just related to the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA. Again, they go through the actual testing and guidance for a disaster, as well as emergency recovery plans. They also just recently added the Coronavirus Emergency Management Best Practices. They offer a lot of fact sheets and kind of checklists, and that way you can kind of go through and make sure that you're covered during that process. Obviously, again, when it comes down to emergency management and disaster recovery plan, it's not a cookie cutter approach. Every entity is a little bit different. But again, I think the more information that you can obtain from that and just to be prepared as much as possible, again, I think the better off that you'll be. So I'll certainly open it up for any questions if there are any. But again, I just want to revisit the fact that, again, now while everything is still fresh in everybody's mind, now is the perfect opportunity to kind of revisit some of these plans. And if you didn't have plans in place, now is the perfect time to formalize those, again, while it's still fresh on everybody's mind at this time.